VCT Masters Toronto is all wrapped up, so it's time to look back at the tournament and talk about which players had the best stats. We will be looking at many different categories of stats, from stats about kills to stats about everything else Valorant, and talk about which players truly deserved to be in the conversation for MVP. Obviously MVP going to Forsaken, but was he actually the best player at this tournament? Let's talk about it. So this is the board we have today. I will be slowly revealing each stats. I do this after every international tournament. This time I did decide to switch a couple things up. But anyways, we will be starting with one of the more basic stats that we have for Valorant, and that is ACS. ACS, or Average Combat Score, is a stat that Valorant uses to rank players in-game. All your leaderboards after every game based off of that. Texture did end up coming in at the number 1 spot here with a ACS of 258.2. Very good number there. Right behind him is a player that did go all the way to the grand final. That is Alvair, 257.9. He was fantastic throughout Fnatic's run and expect to see him a lot in this video. Coming in at the number 3 spot. Now, Sprain wasn't technically number 3, but I had 2 rules for this video. I had to put some limitations on which players were going to be in this video, so the minimum requirement is 100 rounds, but also you had to make it past Swiss. So Wisey was actually number 3 in this ACS stat, but I decided not to put him down. So because of those requirements, Sprain does end up being in the number 3. He had an ACS of 244.1, being that fantastic smokes player for Wolves, being one of the main, if not the main reason why they made it as far as they did. He looked absolutely incredible. He was giving me vibes of Chichu back in 2024, specifically that Champions run that EDG had. So Sprain, if Wolves are going to continue to be a top team in the league, then they're going to have to rely on him a lot. Moving on, we have rating, specifically based off of VLR rating. So Texture shows up here once again. And there's a very real argument that if Gen G were to make it to the grand finals, Texture probably was going to get the MVP. He was incredible throughout Gen G's entire run. While they didn't go as far as I think they wanted to, Texture was the main reason why they got as far as they did in the first place. Showing that right now he might be a bit of a hard carry for Gen G, because when he wasn't on, they were not playing well. But he did end up having a 1.23 VL rating for the entire tournament. Very impressive. Interesting fact about this rating stat, none of the players that were in the grand final end up being in the top 3 here. Sprain ends up showing up once again with a 1.21, and Trent at number 3 with a 1.17. Moving on, we have kills per round. Now Texture once again shows up here, but this time he is tied for first place with Alvair. Both Alvair and Texture at an insane 0.94 kills per round. This means these players were nearly getting a kill every single round. That's how impactful they were. Texture's number here especially being impressive based off of the fact that this team did play a lot of games, going all the way through Swiss stage, so playing a very large amount of Valorant and still ended up being at least almost a kill per round. That's very impressive. And of course, Alvair matching that number, very impressive work as well. Again, he was just absolutely insane. He did make an argument during the post-game press conference that he thinks he deserved the MVP, and just because they lost doesn't mean that he shouldn't necessarily be allowed it. And that is a conversation we can have for sure. By and large, he might have ended up being the MVP of the entire tournament, being that crucial part of Fnatic's run to the grand final. But unfortunately, it seems like the VCT is favoring players that are on the winning team. So Forsaken ended up getting it, and he will show up on this list, but so far in these kind of more basic stats, we don't see him a lot. Sprain also comes in at a 0.85, so again, for a player that's primarily playing a smokes role, that's insane. Such an incredible player to watch during this tournament, just being absolutely stellar on those kills. Moving on, we have total kills. Now, total kills isn't the most relevant stat. As we can see on the board, 3 players from the grand final show up here, and that makes a lot of sense. That's just kind of how this stat works. If the more you play, the more kills you get. Makes sense. But I still like looking at overall kills because I think it's interesting. Alvair does end up being number 1 yet again, with 392 kills total in the entire tournament. And doing that while just playing the playoff stage, that's pretty impressive. Same with Kayako at 327 kills. Jin comes in at number 3 with 303. That number definitely makes a lot of sense considering that Paper X played throughout the entire tournament. They played through matches in Swiss, and then they didn't play the maximum amount of matches that they could have in the playoff stage. But Jin still ends up being that that total top fragger for Paper X being incredibly important in that run, especially in that grand final. That play that him and Devi did with the ice wall, that was absolute money. Incredible play from both of them to get Paper X that first map win in that grand final, their first ever grand final win. Moving on, we have first kills per round. Now this is generally a duelist stat, as we can see on the board. Texture ends up coming in at number 1 yet again, but this time he is tied as well. 0.21 first kills per round. Jemkin ties him with 0.21. Yes, RQ only played 2 matches, so part of me considered not putting him on this list, but he met the requirements that I have, so kind of have to. And then Zekin comes in at 3rd with 0.19. So these duelist players definitely showing a lot of ability in getting that first kill, creating that space for them. RQ didn't go very far in this tournament, but Jemkin still found a way to at least be effective at those first kills. Moving on, we have KD ratio, so pretty basic stat when it comes to FPS games. How many kills versus how many deaths do you have? Well, Texture ends up with a very impressive 1.44. Now just for reference, the highest that I usually see is around where Alphair is at a 1.30. Think of players like Ospos in the Americas, he's usually around that number. Getting a number like Sprains is a solid performance, but not necessarily elite. I think elite is probably 1.25 to 30. And then anything above that is just an insane number. So Texture getting 1.44, nearly breaking into a 1.5 KD ratio range is absolutely insane at the international level. He was fragging absolutely heavy, and he might have been able to get to that 1.5 if Genji didn't choke. Moving on, we have a bit of a negative stat here. This is first deaths per round. Zekin ends up coming in at number 1, so while he is 3rd on first kills per round when it comes to first deaths, it seems like that was costing him. 0.23 ended up being that stat. This isn't necessarily the worst stat for duelist players do have, as we can see both Jogamo and Texture make it on here as well. Jogamo with a 0.19 and Texture with a 0.17. Duelist players usually end up being that first death for their team. It's just kind of how it goes, but the players that are able to minimize that usually do pretty well. But these numbers aren't necessarily horrific or anything, so it's not the worst. Moving on, we have headshot percentage. So what percentage of your shots that do hit end up hitting the head? Well, Cushy was at a pretty impressive 39%. Very good stuff from him, quite good aim. Trent comes in at number 2, tied with Kayak, 35% for both of those players. So going to the top 4 with the 35% headshot percentage is quite good. Usually we see the number drop as teams play more Valorant, but these players still being able to maintain a pretty high percentage at 35%. That's definitely a good sign for both of those players. Moving on, we have ADR, or average damage per round. Alphair, yet again, number 1, 167.6. Absolutely insane amount of damage. Sprain coming in at number 2 with a 160.1. And Texture, yet again, shows up here, 159.5. So we're seeing a lot of the same players show up, and that's usually how this goes in these stats videos. But it is quite interesting to see that Paper X, despite winning the entire tournament, don't have a ton of appearances on the board. There are more that we will see, but so far throughout all these stats, we only have Jane, and that's just total kills, which is arguably the least, I guess, relevant stat that we have, even though it is still quite good. So having 2 players that were in top 3 teams in Alphair and Sprain is pretty standard. Not seeing players from the winning team show up once after another, that is different than past tournaments. And honestly, that's probably a good thing. I think Paper X showed at this tournament that they can be an overall good team, not just a team that relies on individual performances. A lot of players were in great form, but also not the best form that they've been in individually, but the best form they've been in as a team. That's definitely what won them this tournament. It's won other teams' tournaments in the past. Maybe they can do it again. We'll see. Moving on, we have multi-kills. So I thought this would be interesting to put down because this is showing that like which players come up to have those big rounds. Of course, we have 3 players from the grand finals, but Alphair having 20 more than number 2 is quite insane. 106 multi-kills for him. So getting more than 2 kills at least 106 times. That's pretty crazy. Kayak comes in at number 2 with 86 and Jane at number 3 with 82. So we do see Jane show up once again. So did Jane deserve to be the MVP over Forsaken? Well, Forsaken does show up in our next stat, which might be the most important on the entire board, and that is clutch percentage. Clutch percentage. So how many times did you win a clutch situation? When it's you against 4 players, 3 players, etc., can you end up winning the whole round? Players with that ice in their veins, able to win these clutches, win tournaments. I remember back to Champions 2023, what really impressed me about that tournament is Calm was just absolutely insane in the clutch. Felt like it was winning every situation that was not favorable for him. But at this tournament, Texture ends up being the number one in this category. He had a 37% clutch percentage. He won 7 out of 19 potential clutch situations. Very good there. However, Forsaken comes in at number 2 with a 31% clutch percentage. Overall, Forsaken was very good in the clutch for his team, and honestly might have been the reason why he did get that MVP. He was just always good when he needed to be. This was a tournament that he was just like, I'm not losing this. Paper X were able to push through that adversity, Forsaken being probably the best player at doing that. Juicy was also tied with him at 31%. Makes sense. He did have some pretty big moments, 5 wins in 16 potential clutch situations. Juicy was overall quite inconsistent this tournament, but did have those big moments, so that is definitely important. So that does it for our player stats, but I wanted to go over some other stats. First off, looking at map pool. So I wanted to talk about which maps were picked the most. Lotus comes in at number 1, being picked 12 times total. One of the more popular maps in Valorant. I am personally not a fan, but I know a lot of people disagree with me on that one. I don't know, man. It's just a map that feels like it's so big, but it just feels so small. I don't know, man. I'm just not a big fan of it, but seems to be pretty popular, 12 picks total. And tied at number 2 is Icebox and Sunset with 11. I like Sunset and Icebox while everybody hates it. Seems to be picked a lot. And to round out our entire video, we have agent picks. So we do have the percentages of these most picked agents. Omen easily at number 1 with an 82% pick, being picked on most maps, being really good in almost any smoke situation. Always a good character to have on your team. Omen's just a pretty standard good smokes agent. Coming in number 2, Viper. Who cares about the nerfs that came last year? 63% for her. Yet another very useful character to have, especially on those bigger maps. Definitely good character to have on maps like Lotus, maps like Icebox. And Sova comes in at the number 3 spot, 53% for him. With the Tejo nerf, we saw a lot more diversity in the initiator picks, but Sova did end up being that top pick. 53% being very crucial to a lot of team comps. So those are all the stats I want to talk about today at VCT Masters Toronto. Definitely a really interesting stats board, more interesting than previous tournaments. We had the tournament MVP in Forsaken not be number 1 in any of the categories on the board. Number 2 in clutch percentage, that's very important, but man, Alpha Year could absolutely make the argument that he should have been the MVP even though they lost. Texture as well definitely had an argument, but they didn't even get top 4, so that's kind of irrelevant. If Genji had gone to the final and potentially win it, then we might be having a different conversation, but again, we don't live in that fantasy world. But Alpha Year played incredibly well. Spring absolutely came onto the scene in a big way. I definitely want to see him at the international level again. If there's anything more that I need to cheer Wolves on for, because there's such a likable team, Juicy is definitely that player I want to see again. But yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting stats board. Let me know in the comment section down below. What do you think of all these? What do you think is the most relevant to talk about? Who do you think should have been MVP? Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.